Chapter 1: The Golden Cage of Streetlam. The taste of freedom is a bitter vintage when one realizes the gold in their pockets is the very weight that will eventually pull them beneath the waves. Before we unravel the harrowing journey of Mary Eleanor Bowes, a woman who dared to challenge the very foundations of British law to reclaim her soul, I invite you to join our growing community of history enthusiasts by sharing in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. If you find yourself captivated by stories of resilience and the triumph of the human spirit, please take a moment to like this video, share it with a fellow soul who loves a tale of justice, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of our journey through the shadows of the past. In the year 1777, the air in London was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the electric hum of scandal, but for Mary Eleanor Bowes, the Countess of Strathmore, the world was a garden of quiet possibilities. She was 28 years old, possessed of a sharp, inquisitive mind, and a fortune that made her the most coveted prize in the kingdom. Her late husband had left her with a vast empire of coal mines, castles, and rolling green acres, but he had also left her with something far more dangerous, the autonomy to choose her own path. Mary walked through the manicured hedges of her estate, her silk skirts whispering against the grass, unaware that eyes were watching her from the periphery, eyes that saw not a woman, but a mountain of gold waiting to be mined. Among the vultures circling the Countess was Captain Andrew Robinson Stoney, a man whose charm was as polished as his blade and whose conscience was as empty as his pockets. Andrew was a soldier of fortune, a man who understood the theatre of seduction better than the strategy of war. He knew that a woman like Mary, though intelligent and scientifically minded, was vulnerable to the grand, sweeping gestures of a hero. He began his campaign not with a proposal, but with a performance that would rival any stage play in the West End. He authored anonymous, scathing letters to the London newspapers, attacking Mary's character and questioning her virtue, only to then appear in public as her most fervent defender. The trap was set with the precision of a master clockmaker. One crisp afternoon, the tension reached a crescendo. Andrew staged a public duel with an editor who had supposedly insulted the Countess's honor. The clash of steel echoed through the park, and as Mary watched, trembling with a mixture of fear and misplaced gratitude, Andrew took a superficial wound to the chest. He fell to his knees, his blood staining his white waistcoat, looking up at her with a gaze that promised eternal devotion. To Mary, he was the only man brave enough to stand against the world for her sake. In a whirlwind of emotion and perceived debt, she surrendered her hand. The wedding was a grand affair, a sea of lace and champagne, but as the vows were exchanged, a cold shiver traced its way down Mary's spine. She didn't notice the way Andrew's smile didn't reach his eyes, nor did she see the way he looked at the deeds to her property, not with love, but with the hunger of a man who had finally caught his prey. The first few weeks of their union were a masquerade of domestic bliss. Andrew, now taking the name Bowes as part of the marriage agreement, was initially attentive, his voice a low, soothing melody that lulled Mary into a false sense of security. They moved between her various estates, from the townhouse in London to the sprawling majesty of Streetlam Castle in County Durham. Mary felt, for a brief moment, that she had found a partner who would help her manage the crushing weight of her responsibilities. She began to involve him in the administration of the coal mines, trusting his military discipline to bring order to the accounts. But the captain was not interested in management. He was interested in total acquisition. He began to subtly suggest that the stresses of her business were too much for her delicate constitution. He would sit by the fireplace, nursing a glass of brandy, and speak of how the world was a cruel place for a woman of property. "Let me carry the burden, my love," he would whisper, his hand resting heavy on her shoulder. "You were meant for your botany, for your books, for the quiet beauty of the gardens. Leave the ledgers and the lawyers to me." It was a slow poisoning of her confidence. He began to intercept her mail, claiming he wanted to spare her the headache of mundane correspondence. He dismissed her long-standing stewards, men who had served her father for decades, replacing them with his own associates, men with hard eyes and silent tongues. Mary found herself increasingly isolated in her own home. The vibrant social circle she had once hosted began to thin, invitations to balls went unanswered, and friends who called were told the Countess was indisposed, or resting under doctor's orders. When Mary confronted Andrew about these changes, his demeanor shifted like a weather vane in a storm. The soft-spoken hero vanished, replaced by a man of icy, calculated authority. He told her she was becoming hysterical, that her grief for her late husband was clouding her judgment. He used her love for her children as a weapon, hinting that if she didn't focus on her health and her duties as a wife, he might have to send the children away for their own stability. The threat was unspoken but heavy, a dark cloud hanging over the nursery. Mary began to realize that she hadn't married a protector, she had invited a wolf into her hearth. The realization came in flashes, a door locked from the outside, for her safety, a favorite maid dismissed without cause, the way the servants now looked at the floor when she entered a room. Streetlam Castle, once a symbol of her family's power, was transforming into a prison of stone and silence. Andrew's demands for her to sign over the control of her trusts became more frequent and more aggressive. He would keep her awake late into the night, pacing the floor of their bedchamber, shouting about debts and the disrespect she showed him by withholding her signature. He was a man obsessed with the idea of being the true Earl, a man who felt the fortune was his by right of conquest. Mary, despite the growing terror that tightened her throat, found a spark of her father's iron will within her. She knew that if she signed those papers, she would lose more than just her money, she would lose the only leverage she had to protect her children and her own life. She began to play a dangerous game of her own, feigning illness to buy time, hiding keys in the hems of her dresses, and training herself to observe the patterns of Andrew's moods. She noticed that he was most volatile after he had been drinking, and most distracted when he was boasting to his new associates in the dining hall. During those hours, she would sit by the window of her locked room, staring out at the distant hills of the North Country, mourning the woman she had been just months ago. She thought of the prenuptial agreement she had insisted upon before the wedding, a document Andrew had laughed off as a mere formality but which she had ensured was legally binding. It was her shield, the only thing standing between him and the total decimation of her legacy. She knew he hated that paper more than he hated her. He called it a betrayal of the marriage bed, a sign that she had never truly trusted him. But as the winter winds began to howl around the turrets of Streetlam, Mary realized that her trust had been a death sentence. She was the richest woman in England, and she was a hostage. Every meal was a test, every conversation a minefield. She had to become a ghost in her own life, a silent observer of her own ruin, all while planning a way to reach the world beyond the gates. The romantic tension that had once drawn her to Andrew had fermented into a visceral, skin-crawling dread. When he touched her, she had to force her muscles not to recoil. When he spoke of their future, she saw only a grave. But in the darkness of her isolation, Mary's mind became a sharpening stone. She realized that the law, the very thing that had traditionally kept women in the shadows of their husbands, was her only hope. She began to formulate a plan, not just to escape the castle, but to escape the marriage. It was an unthinkable notion in the 18th century, a woman of her status suing for separation, but Mary Eleanor Bowes was no longer a woman of status. She was a woman of survival. She knew the captain would kill her before he let her walk away with the fortune, and she knew that the walls of Streetlam were closing in. The golden cage was narrowing, its bars becoming sharper with every passing day. As she watched the snow begin to fall, blanketing the estates she technically owned but could no longer walk upon, Mary whispered a vow to the empty room. She would not be the tragic footnote in Andrew Stoney Bowes's climb to power. She would be the woman who broke the cage. Chapter 2, The Mask Falls. The wedding bells had barely ceased their ringing before the velvet glove of Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes was cast aside to reveal the rusted iron beneath. It began with the quiet removal of Mary's favorite things. Her botanical journals were moved to a damp cellar, and her correspondence with the great minds of Europe was lost in transit. But the true horror was the systematic isolation he enforced with chilling precision. Mary soon found that her home, the grand and ancient Streetlam Castle, had become a labyrinth of restricted zones. Andrew, no longer the weeping hero who had bled for her honor, now stalked the corridors with a heavy tread that made the floorboards groan in sympathy with Mary's heart. He had replaced her trusted staff with a collection of ruffians and sycophants who looked at the Countess not with the respect due to their mistress, but with the cold appraisal of wardens. Every time she tried to assert her authority, he would meet her with a calm, terrifying gaslighting, telling her that her nerves were getting the better of her and that a period of quiet seclusion was the only cure for her feminine hysteria. The psychological warfare soon graduated to physical coercion. Andrew was obsessed with the prenuptial deed Mary had signed, a document that kept her vast fortune in a trust he could not touch. He would wake her in the middle of the night, holding a single guttering candle to her face, and demand she sign a revocation. When she refused, his voice, once so full of poetic devotion, would turn into a rasping snarl. He began to restrict her movement to a single wing of the house, then a single suite of rooms. He controlled her diet, claiming she was overheated, and monitored her every conversation. The romantic tension that had once been the fuel for their whirlwind courtship had curdled into a visceral, skin-crawling dread. Mary realized that every word he had ever spoken to her was a calculated lie, part of a long con designed to strip her of her dignity and her wealth. She was no longer a wife, she was a political prisoner in a war for her own identity. The most agonizing blow came when Andrew began to alienate her from her children. He told them their mother was unwell, her mind fractured by the weight of her inheritance. He would allow her only brief, supervised visits, during which he would stand in the corner, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt, a silent reminder of his total control. Mary had to bite her tongue until it bled to keep from screaming the truth to her little ones. She knew that any sign of instability would give him the legal grounds to have her committed to a private asylum, a fate many wealthy women suffered when their husbands grew tired of their presence but remained hungry for their purses. She watched from the high windows of her chamber as her children played in the gardens below, the distance between them feeling like an ocean. The woman who had been the most celebrated intellect in London was being reduced to a ghost, a shadow flitting behind the heavy drapes of a northern castle. Yet, even as her body grew thin from the meager rations Andrew provided, Mary's mind remained a fortress. She began to observe the cracks in his own armor. Andrew was a man of immense vanity and explosive temper, traits that made him prone to arrogance. He believed he had already won. He began to spend more time in the local taverns, boasting of his conquest of the great Bowes fortune, leaving his henchmen to guard the Countess. During these bouts of his absence, Mary started to carefully map the routines of the household. She noticed that one young kitchen maid, a girl named Mary, looked at her with a flicker of genuine pity rather than the hardened indifference of the others. It was a tiny crack in the wall, but for the Countess, it was a beacon of light. She began to leave small tokens for the girl, a ribbon, a scrap of fine lace, tests to see if the girl's loyalty could be nudged toward the mistress of the house. The abuse, however, was not merely psychological. Stoney Bowes began to use his fists to underscore his demands. He would strike her across the face for the smallest perceived slight, then immediately fall to his knees, weeping and claiming that his great love for her made him lose his senses when she betrayed him by withholding her trust. This cycle of violence and artificial remorse was designed to shatter her reality. He wanted her to believe she was the cause of his cruelty, that if she would only yield her money, he could return to being the man who had fought a duel for her. But Mary Eleanor was a student of the world, she knew a predator's patterns. She realized that her signature on those documents wouldn't buy her peace, it would buy her a shallow grave in the moors. He needed her alive only as long as the money remained in her name. By the end of their first year of marriage, the transformation was complete. The vibrant, laughing Countess was gone, replaced by a pale, silent woman who moved through the castle like a spectre. She learned to hide her bruises under thick layers of powder and lace, and she learned the art of the hidden letter. Using lemon juice and scraps of paper salvaged from the library, she began to write to her legal advisers in London, detailing the atrocities being committed within the walls of Streetlam. She had to be flawless, one intercepted letter would mean her end. The tension in the house was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on everyone. Even the guards seemed to feel the weight of the captain's escalating madness. He was beginning to suspect that the docile wife he had created was merely a mask, and his paranoia led him to double the locks on her doors. One evening, after a particularly brutal confrontation where he had threatened to take her to the most desolate of his properties in the north, Mary sat by the fire, her hand trembling as she touched a fresh welt on her cheek. She looked into the flames and saw not the end of her life, but the beginning of a war. She realized that Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes had made one fatal mistake. He had assumed that by stripping her of her friends, her children, and her freedom, he had stripped her of her power. He did not realize that in the vacuum of her isolation, her will had become a diamond, hard, cold, and capable of cutting through the very bars he had built around her. She was Mary Eleanor Bowes, and she was no longer afraid of the dark. She was merely waiting for the moon to hide behind the clouds so she could begin her flight. The silence of the castle was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a long case clock in the hall, each second a heartbeat in the countdown to her escape. She knew the risks. To leave a husband was to become an outlaw in the eyes of the church and the state. She would be hunted like an animal. She would be slandered in every broadsheet in the country. But as she looked at the door, she knew that the only thing more terrifying than leaving was staying. The man she had married was a void, a bottomless pit of greed and malice, and if she stayed, he would consume her until there was nothing left but dust. She closed her eyes and visualized the road to London, a ribbon of hope stretching through the night. She whispered a prayer, not for mercy, but for strength. The hunt was about to begin, and she intended to be the one who survived. Chapter 3: A Fortress of Silence. The isolation of Streetlam was merely the first movement in Andrew's symphony of control. The second required a location even more desolate, where the screams of a woman would be swallowed by the wind and the ancient stones. He decided to move Mary to Gibside, a remote estate in the north where the towering trees and crumbling fortifications provided a more literal prison. To the world, it was a change of scenery for his ailing wife. To Mary, it was the slamming of a tomb door. Andrew had become obsessed with the idea that the London lawyers were conspiring with her, and his paranoia turned Gibside into a fortress. He boarded up the lower windows and patrolled the perimeter with a pack of dogs that seemed to share their master's snarling temperament. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp stone and the metallic tang of fear. Andrew no longer bothered with the pretense of affection. He was now a gaoler in every sense of the word. He spent his days drinking heavily in the great hall, surrounded by men who had no qualms about using violence to earn their keep. Mary's daily existence was reduced to a series of humiliations designed to erode her sense of self. He would force her to stand for hours while he critiqued her every flaw, from the paleness of her skin to the way her hands trembled when she held her embroidery. He took a perverse pleasure in ruining the things she loved most. Her botanical specimens, collected with such care over the years, were thrown into the hearth as she watched, the rare petals shriveling into ash. "A wife has no need for science," he would sneer, his breath smelling of stale ale. "She needs only to learn the science of obedience." He began to demand that she write letters to her family and associates, dictating every word, to assure them she was happy and well treated. If she hesitated, the punishment would begin: days spent in a cold cellar without light, or the terrifying presence of his hand tightening around her throat until the world turned grey at the edges. Despite the darkness, Mary found that her mind was a place he could not reach. In the silence of her room, she reconstructed the maps of her estates, the lineages of her plants, and the complex legal arguments she had once read. She realized that Stoney Bowes's greatest weakness was his own ego. He truly believed he had broken her. Because she no longer fought back physically, he began to grow careless. He assumed her silence was submission, not a strategic gathering of strength. Mary began to observe the servants with the sharp eyes of a naturalist. Most were terrified of the captain, but she noticed a young maid named Mary, a girl with kind eyes who often lingered a moment longer than necessary when bringing the Countess her meager meals. One afternoon, while Andrew was away at a local cockfight, Mary Eleanor took a desperate gamble. She caught the girl's hand as she set down a tray of watered-down broth. "I am being murdered by degrees," Mary whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. "If you help me, I will ensure your family never wants for anything. If you don't, I will surely die in this house." The maid's eyes widened, darting toward the door where a guard's shadow loomed. For a heartbeat, Mary thought the girl would scream. Instead, the girl squeezed her hand in return, a silent pact formed in the shadow of tyranny. From that day on, the dynamic within the fortress changed. The maid became Mary's lifeline, smuggling scraps of paper and lead pencils into the room. Mary Eleanor began to write her secret history, a detailed account of every blow, every threat, and every theft Stoney Bowes had committed. She knew that the law was biased toward men, but she also knew that the sheer volume of his cruelty, if documented correctly, would be a weapon he could not ignore. She wrote with a feverish intensity, hiding the pages beneath the floorboards or sewn into the lining of her petticoats. Every stroke of the pencil was an act of rebellion, a way to reclaim the narrative of her life from the man who sought to erase it. The psychological tension within Gibside reached a fever pitch as the weeks bled into months. Andrew's financial situation was becoming desperate. His creditors were no longer swayed by his promises of impending wealth. This desperation made him more volatile. He began to accuse Mary of poisoning his food, of whispering to the walls, of conjuring spirits to haunt him. He would storm into her room at 3 in the morning, dragging her from her bed to search for evidence of her treachery. He tore through her clothes, ripped the drapes from the windows, and once even slaughtered her favorite songbird in a fit of pique. Through it all, Mary remained a statue of icy composure. She had learned that any emotional reaction only fed his hunger for power. When he screamed, she stared through him. When he struck her, she calculated the legal weight of the bruise. She was no longer his wife, she was his prosecutor, and she was building a case that would echo through the centuries. Romantic tension had long since vanished, replaced by a morbid, predatory dance. Andrew was increasingly fascinated by her refusal to break. He would sometimes sit in her room for hours, watching her read or sew, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and a strange, warped admiration. "You are a boast through and through," he once said, his voice almost a caress. "Stubborn as the coal in your mines. But even coal burns if you apply enough heat." He began to use her children as the ultimate heat, showing her letters he claimed were from them, pleading for her to be a good mother so they could be reunited. Mary knew they were forgeries, the handwriting was too regular, the language too adult, but the pain of being separated from them was a physical ache that never subsided. She used that pain as fuel, turning her maternal longing into a fierce, protective rage. She would get back to them, and she would do it by destroying the man who kept them apart. The turning point came when Andrew announced his intention to take her even further north, to a desolate cottage in the Highlands where no lawyer would ever find her. Mary knew that if she left Gibside, she would never return alive. The isolation of the Highlands would provide the perfect cover for her accidental death once he finally found a way to bypass the trust. She signaled to her maid that the time for the escape was drawing near. They began to hoard small amounts of food and warm clothing, hiding them in a hollowed-out tree near the kitchen garden. Mary Eleanor spent her nights memorizing the path through the woods, calculating the distance to the main road where she hoped to find a carriage. The risk was astronomical. If caught, Andrew would likely kill her on the spot, or worse, chain her to the bed for the rest of her days. But as she looked at her reflection in the darkened window, a woman aged beyond her years, her beauty shadowed by trauma, she saw a flicker of the girl who had once dreamed of discovering new worlds. In those final nights at Gibside, the fortress of silence became a hive of secret activity. Mary Eleanor and the maid communicated through a series of taps on the wall and coded messages left in the laundry. The air seemed to thrum with the electricity of their conspiracy. Andrew, sensing a change in the atmosphere but unable to pin it down, became even more oppressive, refusing to leave the estate even for his usual bouts of drinking. He felt the threads of his control slipping, though he couldn't see the scissors. Mary Eleanor, meanwhile, was preparing her spirit for the physical ordeal ahead. She knew her body was weak, but her will was a tempered blade. She would walk through the moors on bare feet if she had to. She would swim the icy rivers of the north to reach the sanctuary of the law. The rich heiress was gone, and in her place stood a titan of survival, ready to burn down the golden cage and everyone who sought to keep her in it. Chapter 4: The Secret Pact. The walls of Gibside were not merely built of stone and mortar, they were reinforced by the suffocating weight of Andrew's constant surveillance, yet it was within this very shadow that the first sparks of Mary Eleanor's liberation began to flicker. In the 18th century, a woman of her standing was never truly alone, yet Mary had never felt more isolated, surrounded by a household of spies who reported her every side to the captain. However, the human spirit has a way of finding kin in the darkest of corners, and for Mary, that kin arrived in the form of a young, quiet maid whose presence Andrew had overlooked as a mere piece of furniture. While the captain sat downstairs, intoxicated by his own perceived invincibility and the fine brandy he had stolen from Mary's cellars, a silent understanding was being forged over the simple act of laying a fire or smoothing a bedsheet. This maid, a woman of little means but immense courage, began to see past the hysterical facade Andrew had painted for the world, recognizing instead the systematic destruction of a brilliant mind. It was a secret pact born of shared silence, a quiet rebellion that would eventually shake the very pillars of the English legal system. Mary began to test the boundaries of this new alliance with the delicate precision of a master gardener. She would leave small, seemingly accidental clues of her true state, a smudge of ink on her finger, a scrap of Latin verse left near a candle, watching to see if the girl would report them. When the maid instead offered a fleeting, sympathetic glance or a slightly deeper bow, Mary knew she had found her bridge to the outside world. The risk was absolute. If Andrew discovered so much as a whispered word of dissent, the maid would be cast out without a character, or worse, and Mary would be plunged into a darkness from which there was no return. Yet, the desperation for agency outweighed the fear of the lash. Mary began to use the maid to smuggle out the secret history she had been meticulously composing, a harrowing chronicle of every bruise, every deprivation, and every legal theft Stoney Bowes had orchestrated. These pages, hidden in the girl's bodice or tucked into the linings of laundry baskets, were Mary's only hope of proving that her marriage was not a union, but a slow-motion execution. The romantic tension that Andrew still tried to maintain, a grotesque parody of their courtship, became the very tool Mary used to distract him. She learned the art of the tactical surrender, playing the part of the broken, dutiful wife with such conviction that even Andrew's sharp, cynical mind began to soften its guard. She would sit at his feet in the evenings, her eyes cast down, listening to his endless, repetitive boasts of his own greatness, all while her mind was miles away, calculating the cost of a post-chaise to London and the location of her trusted solicitor, Mr. Farr. She allowed Andrew to believe his discipline was working, that he had finally tamed the wild, intellectual Countess of Strathmore. This performance was the ultimate humiliation for a woman of her pride, but it provided the cover she needed. While Andrew basked in the glow of his supposed victory, Mary was coordinating a complex web of communication, her letters passing through the hands of the maid to a network of loyalists who still remembered the kindness of the Bowes family before the captain's reign of terror. The psychological toll of this double life was immense, a constant, vibrating strain that threatened to snap Mary's composure at any moment. She had to watch as Andrew sold off her prized horses, as he cut down ancient oaks on her estate to pay his gambling debts, and as he continued to keep her children as collateral for her obedience. Every day was a battle of wills played out in the silence of a drawing-room or the suffocating intimacy of the bedchamber. Stoney Bowes would sometimes catch her looking at him, and for a fleeting second, his eyes would narrow with the old suspicion, wondering if the fire in her had truly been extinguished. In those moments, Mary would force a tear or a tremble, leaning into the role of the frail victim he so desperately wanted her to be. It was a dance on the edge of a razor, a game where one false step meant the loss of her fortune, her children, and her very life. But the pact with the maid grew stronger with every passing week, a shared secret that gave Mary the strength to endure the unendurable. As the winter of 1785 approached, the urgency of their plan reached a breaking point. Andrew's creditors were closing in, and his temper had become a jagged, unpredictable thing that struck out at everyone in his path. He began to talk openly of moving Mary to the most remote corners of the north, where he could finish her education, without the prying eyes of the Durham gentry. Mary knew that finishing her education was a euphemism for a permanent disappearance. She signaled to her ally that the escape must happen soon, regardless of the weather or the moon. They began to hoard small supplies, a sturdy cloak, a pair of thick boots hidden in a chimney, and the few jewels Mary had managed to keep from Andrew's grasp. The maid, risking her life with every trip to the village, established a contact with a local innkeeper who remained loyal to the memory of Mary's father. A carriage would be waiting at the edge of the Gibside woods on the first night the captain fell into a particularly deep, drunken stupor. The tension in the household was so thick it seemed to dampen the sound of the falling snow. Even the guards, sensing the captain's spiraling madness, seemed more on edge, their hands never far from their cudgels. Mary spent her night staring at the heavy oak door of her chamber, visualizing the moment she would turn the key. A key she had slowly, painstakingly copied from a wax impression she had taken months ago. She thought of her children, their faces a blurred memory through the fog of her captivity, and the thought was a physical ache in her chest. She wasn't just escaping for her own sake, she was escaping to reclaim their future from the man who was systematically dismantling their inheritance. The secret pact was no longer just a conspiracy of two women, it was a crusade for the restoration of a family's honor and the right of a woman to exist as something more than a husband's shadow. On the final night before the planned flight, Andrew entered Mary's room, uncharacteristically sober and filled with a quiet, menacing energy. He sat on the edge of her bed, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the wall, and spoke of his plans for their new life in the Highlands. He spoke of the isolation as if it were a gift, a way for them to be truly one, without the interference of the world. He touched her hair, a gesture that made Mary's skin crawl with an almost unbearable revulsion, yet she forced herself to smile, to nod, to play the part until the very end. She realized then that he didn't just want her money, he wanted her soul to be entirely subsumed by his own. He wanted to look into her eyes and see nothing but a reflection of his own power. When he finally left, locking the door behind him with a heavy, final thud, Mary didn't weep. She stood up, reached into the hidden compartment of her vanity, and drew out the heavy, cold iron of the key. The silence of Gibside was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a great storm. Mary Eleanor Bowes, the woman the world thought was broken, stood in the center of her prison and felt a surge of cold, diamond-hard resolve. She looked at the maid, who had slipped into the room through the connecting servant's door, her face pale but determined. There were no words left to say. The pact was sealed, the path was laid, and the law of the land, which had so far been her enemy, was about to be challenged by a woman who had nothing left to lose but her chains. The great escape was no longer a dream, it was a necessity. As she donned the heavy cloak and prepared to step into the freezing night, she knew that if she were caught, she would die. But if she stayed, she was already dead. With a final, lingering look at the gilded cage she was leaving behind, Mary Eleanor Bowes stepped into the darkness, a countess turning into a fugitive, and a victim turning into a legend. Chapter 5, The Midnight Flight. The night of February 7, 1785, descended upon the North Country with a violent, freezing wind that rattled the window panes of Gibside like the ghostly fingers of the ancestors Andrew had so thoroughly insulted. Inside the fortress, the air was heavy with the thick, cloying scent of roasted meat and the sharp, acidic tang of the cheap wine Andrew had been consuming since midday. Mary Eleanor stood behind the heavy velvet curtains of her bedchamber, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared it might be audible to the guard stationed in the hallway. This was the precipice. For years, she had been a captive audience to her husband's brutality, a silent witness to the systematic looting of her life's work. Now, she was about to step into a void of uncertainty, where the only thing more dangerous than the elements was the man who claimed to own her. She looked at the small, leather-bound satchel hidden beneath her bed. It contained nothing but her secret history, a few scorched botanical sketches, and the iron will of a woman who had finally reached her breaking point. The signal came not as a sound, but as an absence of one. The heavy, rhythmic snoring of Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes began to echo from the master suite, a guttural, beastly sound that signaled his descent into a drunken stupor. Mary's ally, the brave young maid, appeared in the shadows of the connecting door, her face a mask of terrified resolve. They didn't speak, the air was too thin for words. With trembling hands, Mary donned the heavy, dark cloak they had hidden weeks prior, pulling the hood low over her eyes to obscure the paleness of her face. She took one last look at the room that had been her sanctuary and her cell, the gilded mirrors that had reflected her bruises, the fine silks that had felt like a shroud. She felt a strange, cold detachment. The woman who had entered this marriage as a romantic dreamer was dead, and the woman who was leaving was a creature of pure survival. The descent through the back service stairs was a journey through a nightmare of sensory hyper-awareness. Every creak of the ancient wood sounded like a gunshot, every draft of cold air felt like a hand reaching out to pull her back. They moved past the kitchens, where the dying embers of the hearth cast long, flickering shadows that danced like demons on the soot-stained walls. At the postern door, the maid produced a heavy iron key, her breath hitching as the lock groaned in protest. The door swung open to reveal the raw, biting reality of the northern winter. The snow was a blinding, swirling shroud, and the wind shrieked through the leafless oaks of the estate like a chorus of the damned. Mary stepped out, the frozen ground crunching beneath her boots, and for the first time in years, she breathed air that did not belong to Andrew. It was a sharp, painful inhalation, the taste of freedom seasoned with the terror of the hunt. The trek through the Gibside woods was an ordeal that pushed Mary's frail, neglected body to the brink of collapse. Her skirts, heavy with ice and mud, snagged on brambles that tore at her skin through her stockings. She stumbled, her hands plunging into the freezing slush, but each time she fell, the memory of Andrew's sneering face provided the adrenaline to rise again. Behind them, the dark silhouette of the castle loomed like a hunched predator, its few lit windows looking like malevolent eyes watching her flight. She knew that at any moment, the alarm could be raised. She imagined the hounds being loosed, their baying filling the valley, and the sound of hoofbeats thundering across the frozen turf. The psychological tension was a physical weight, a phantom hand on her shoulder that made her turn her head every few paces, searching the darkness for the glint of a lantern or the flash of a red coat. They reached the perimeter wall, a jagged line of stone that marked the boundary of her prison. Waiting in the hollow of an ancient, gnarled elm was a man Mary barely recognized through the storm, a loyal former steward who had risked everything to provide the means of her escape. A modest, nondescript carriage sat idling in the lane, the horse's breath blooming in the air like white smoke. There was no time for gratitude. Mary was hoisted into the cramped, dark interior, the maid scrambling in beside her. The carriage lurched forward, the wheels fighting for purchase on the icy road, and Mary collapsed against the hard leather seat, her body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. They were moving, but they were far from safe. To reach London, they had to traverse hundreds of miles of territory where Andrew's influence ran deep and where the law of a husband's right to his runaway property was still the prevailing sentiment of the countryside. The journey south was a blur of high-stakes evasion and sensory deprivation. They avoided the main post roads, sticking instead to the winding, treacherous lanes that bypassed the larger coaching inns where Andrew's spies might be lurking. Every time the carriage slowed or a horse whinnied in the distance, Mary felt the cold hand of panic tighten around her throat. She stayed huddled in the corner of the carriage, her eyes fixed on the small, frosted window, watching the dark shapes of the English countryside flash by. She thought of her children, left behind in the clutches of a man who used them as pawns. The guilt was a jagged blade in her heart, but she forced herself to remember that she could only save them if she first saved herself. If she were caught now, Andrew would surely ensure she was never seen again, and her children would grow up believing their mother had simply abandoned them. The romantic tension of her past, the memory of the man who had supposedly fought a duel for her, now felt like a grotesque fever dream. How could she have been so blinded by the theater of devotion? She realized now that Andrew's passion was merely the hunger of a void. As the carriage rattled through the night, she felt a hardening of her spirit. She was no longer the countess who needed a champion, she was the champion of her own cause. She began to mentally rehearse the arguments she would present to the lawyers in London, the way she would describe the cruelty that the law so rarely recognized as grounds for a wife's liberation. She was preparing for a different kind of duel, one fought with parchment and testimony instead of steel and staged blood. The miles between her and Gibside were not just physical distance, they were the layers of a new identity being forged in the crucible of her flight. As the grey, dismal dawn began to break over the outskirts of the capital, the sheer scale of what she had accomplished began to sink in. She had escaped a fortress. She had defied a tyrant. But as the carriage entered the bustling, soot-stained streets of London, Mary knew that the true battle was only beginning. Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes was not a man to accept defeat, especially when that defeat meant the loss of his meal ticket. He would hunt her. He would use every resource, legal and illegal, to drag her back to the north. London, with its teeming millions and its labyrinthine alleys, offered a temporary sanctuary, but it was also a stage where her private trauma would be transformed into public spectacle. Mary Eleanor Bowes stepped out of the carriage at a safe house in Bloomsbury, her legs buckling as they hit the cobblestones, and looked up at the smog-choked sky. She was a fugitive in her own country, the richest woman in England with nothing but the clothes on her back and the truth in her heart. The midnight flight was over, but the war for her soul had just declared its first victory. Chapter 6: The Great Kidnapping. The sanctuary of London was a fragile illusion, a glass shield that Mary Eleanor Bowes desperately hoped would hold against the storm of her husband's rage. For several months, she lived a life of shadow and litigation, hidden away in a series of rented rooms, her only contact with the world being the frantic, whispered conferences with her legal team. Her lead solicitor, Mr. Farr, worked tirelessly to build a case for a divorce mensa et thoro, a legal separation from bed and board, on the grounds of extreme cruelty. It was a revolutionary pursuit. In 1785, the law almost universally favored the husband's right to correct his wife. Yet, Mary's detailed, secret history, and the testimony of the loyal maid provided a gruesome roadmap of Stoney Bowes's depravity. For a brief window of time, Mary began to breathe again. She walked the narrow streets of Bloomsbury under the protection of hired guards, daring to dream of a future where she could reclaim her children and her botanical gardens. But Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes was not a man who accepted the loss of a fortune with grace. He was a predator who had merely been biding his time, studying the patterns of his prey from the darkness of the city's underbelly. The morning of November 10, 1786, broke with a heavy, yellow fog that clung to the Thames and muffled the sounds of the city. Mary had grown perhaps too comfortable in her routine, believing that the legal injunction served against her husband would act as a magical barrier. As she stepped out of her carriage to enter a shop on Oxford Street, the atmosphere shifted with terrifying suddenness. The fog seemed to part not for a friend, but for a nightmare. Out of the gloom stepped Andrew, his face a mask of twisted, manic determination, flanked by a group of armed mercenaries he had hired with the very money he had stolen from her accounts. Before her guards could draw their weapons, the street erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence. Mary's protectors were brutally beaten back, and in broad daylight, surrounded by the shocked citizens of London, the richest woman in England was seized. Her screams were cut short by a heavy hand over her mouth, and she was hoisted into a waiting coach like a bale of wool. The high-speed chase that followed was a descent into the visceral terror of a woman who realized the world had failed her. Andrew sat opposite her in the swaying, rattling coach, a loaded pistol resting on his knee, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and absolute madness. "Did you think a few scraps of parchment could keep me from what is mine?" he hissed, the sound barely audible over the thunder of the horses' hooves. He had planned the abduction with military precision, stationing fresh relays of horses along the Great North Road to ensure that no lawman could catch them. Mary looked out the window, watching the familiar landmarks of the capital blur into the grey horizon of the countryside, her heart sinking with every mile. She was being dragged back to the north, back to the stone walls and the silence, and this time, she knew there would be no sympathetic maid, no second chance at flight. The psychological weight of her recapture was more crushing than any physical blow. It was the realization that her husband considered himself above the law of the land. As the carriage hurtled toward the border of Durham, the romantic tension that had once been the foundation of their marriage was replaced by a raw, predatory energy. Andrew seemed to feed on her fear, his mood vacillating between terrifying rages and a bizarre, mocking tenderness. He would stroke her cheek with the barrel of his pistol, whispering about the re-education that awaited her at their destination. He forced her to travel without rest, without food, and with only the most meager sips of water, intentionally breaking her physical stamina to ensure she could not resist him. Mary realized that this was not just about the money anymore, it was about the total annihilation of her will. He wanted her to beg for his mercy, to admit that she was nothing without him. Yet, even in the depths of her despair, a cold, hard kernel of defiance remained. She watched him, noting the way his hand shook as he drank from a flask of brandy, and the way he checked the road behind them with increasing frequency. He was a man on the run from the law, and that made him dangerous, but it also made him desperate. The public reaction to the kidnapping was a firestorm of indignation. News of the abduction spread like wildfire through the coaching inns and the London coffee houses. The audacity of the crime, a woman of the peerage snatched from the heart of the capital, was an affront to the English liberty that the nation so loudly boasted of. The King's Bench was moved to action, issuing a writ of habeas corpus that commanded Andrew to produce Mary's person before the court. But in the 18th century, a writ was only as good as the men sent to enforce it, and Andrew was moving through territory where he had spent years cultivating a reputation as a man of power and violence. He bypassed the major towns, taking Mary into the rugged, desolate terrain of the Pennines, staying in isolated cottages and remote inns where the keepers were either too terrified or too well paid to intervene. Mary was a hostage in a landscape that seemed to reflect her own internal desolation, grey, windswept, and unforgiving. The nights were the worst. They stayed in a series of safe houses, shacks and derelict farmhouses where the wind whistled through the gaps in the timber. Andrew would chain her to the bedpost or to his own wrist, never allowing her a moment of privacy or peace. He began to demand that she sign a document, confessing that her escape had been a fit of insanity and that she had returned to him of her own free will. He held the pen to her hand, his voice a low, threatening rumble in the darkness. "Sign it, Mary, and the pain stops. Sign it, and we can be as we were." But Mary Eleanor knew that, as we were, was a lie. She thought of the secret history she had left in London, the pages that were even now being read by the most powerful men in the kingdom. She realized that she was no longer just fighting for her own life, she was a living testament to the failure of the marriage laws. If she gave in now, she would validate every cruelty he had ever inflicted. By the time they reached the high moors of Westmoreland, the physical toll on Mary was nearly absolute. Her clothes were tatters of silk and mud, her face was gaunt, and her eyes were shadowed by days of sleeplessness. Yet, she used her botanical knowledge to her advantage, recognizing the herbs in the fields that could provide a modicum of strength or a moment of feigned illness to slow their progress. She became a master of the stall, complaining of faintness or a twisted ankle whenever she sensed they were nearing a village where a rescue might be possible. Andrew's frustration grew into a jagged, explosive thing. He began to realize that the law was closing in. He could hear the metaphorical baying of the hounds behind him. The great kidnapping, which he had intended as his ultimate victory, was turning into a frantic, disorganized retreat. In the final days of this harrowing journey, as they huddled in a lightless cottage near the village of Darlington, the atmosphere between the captor and the captive reached a state of crystalline tension. Andrew stood by the window, clutching his weapon, his eyes bloodshot and wild, while Mary sat on a rough wooden stool, her hands folded in her lap with a deceptive calm. She looked at the man she had once thought was her savior and saw only a small, broken creature who could only feel powerful by making others feel small. The power dynamic had shifted in the silence. He was the one who was afraid, and she was the one with nothing left to lose. The world was hunting Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes, and Mary Eleanor, the woman he had tried to erase, was the very reason for his downfall. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind, waiting for the sound of hoofbeats that would signal the end of the nightmare and the beginning of the law. Chapter 7, The Hostage of the North. The carriage wheels had long since lost their rhythmic trot, replaced by the jarring, bone-deep thuds of a vehicle being forced through the trackless wastes of the northern moors. Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes had abandoned the main roads entirely, driven by a frantic, clawing paranoia that the King's Bench was not merely a legal entity, but a physical beast breathing down his neck. They were now deep in the shadow of the Pennines, a landscape of bruised purples and skeletal greys that seemed to mirror the fading vitality of Mary Eleanor herself. Held captive in a series of increasingly desolate safe houses, Mary was no longer the elegantly dressed countess of the London salons, she was a woman stripped to the rawest elements of survival. Her silks were stained with the soot of peat fires and the mud of the high country, and her spirit was being hammered daily by the man who refused to believe that a woman's soul could not be bought or beaten into submission. Andrew's strategy had shifted from the grand theatre of the kidnapping to a grueling war of attrition. In a small, windowless cottage near the edge of a shivering marsh, the true horror of Mary's predicament reached its zenith. Andrew had discarded all pretenses of gentlemanly conduct. He would sit across from her for hours, the only light provided by a single, guttering tallow candle, and describe in excruciating detail how he would dispose of her if she did not sign a full retraction of her legal complaints. He wanted a signed confession stating that her flight from Gibside had been the result of a distempered mind, and that he, the ever-loving husband, had only been acting to protect her from herself. "The world will believe me, Mary," he would whisper, his voice a dry rasp that set her teeth on edge. "They always believe the man. They want to believe that the richest woman in the land is merely a hysterical girl who needs the firm hand of her master." He withheld food for days, offering her only bread crusts and tainted water, watching her with a predatory fascination to see when the hunger would finally override her pride. But Mary Eleanor Bowes was a daughter of the Enlightenment, a woman whose mind had been forged in the study of the natural world, and she knew that even the most resilient organism had its defense mechanisms. She began to use her perceived weakness as a tactical shield. She played the role of the broken wife with a brilliance that surpassed Andrew's own theatricality. When he shouted, she would collapse into a heap of silent, trembling lace. When he threatened her with the pistol, she would let her eyes roll back as if fainting from terror. This performance bought her the only currency that mattered, time. While Andrew paced the room, fueled by brandy and the delusion of his own success, Mary was mentally mapping the geography of their movements. She listened to the accents of the men he hired, identifying the regional dialects of County Durham and North Yorkshire, and she noted the position of the stars through the cracks in the roof. She was a hostage, yes, but she was also a spy in the heart of her own tragedy. The psychological tension between them had evolved into a twisted, intimate dance of death. Andrew, in his moments of drunken melancholy, would sometimes weep at her feet, lamenting that she had forced him to be cruel. He would speak of the romantic tension of their first meeting, the staged duel, and the passion that had once existed between them, as if those memories could somehow validate the current nightmare. Mary would remain a statue of icy indifference during these displays, her heart a cold, hard stone. She realized that the man she had married did not exist, he was a composite of lies and greed. This clarity gave her a strange, detached strength. Even as her body grew frail and her hands shook from the cold, her resolve remained absolute. She would not sign. She would not grant him the legal victory that would allow him to continue his reign of terror over her children and her estates. She was the anchor holding her entire legacy in place, and she would not let go. The environment itself became a character in her captivity. The relentless northern rain hammered against the cottage, and the wind shrieked through the heather like the voices of the creditors Andrew was so desperately trying to outrun. He was becoming a haunted man. He started to see the king's messengers in every passing shepherd and heard the sound of the law in every thunderclap. His desperation led to an escalation of violence that brought Mary to the very threshold of death. In one particularly dark episode, he dragged her out into the freezing night, forcing her to kneel in the mud while he held a cocked pistol to her temple. "One movement of my finger, Mary, and the Bowes fortune is mine by inheritance," he snarled. Mary looked up at him, her face pale in the moonlight, and felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. She realized that if he killed her, he lost everything. She was his only leverage. In that moment, the power shifted irrevocably. She saw the tremor in his hand and the fear in his eyes. He was the prisoner of his own greed, and she was the only one who held the key. As the days bled into a second week of captivity, the net began to tighten. The reward for Mary's rescue had grown to a staggering sum, and the entire North Country was alive with the hunt. Local farmers, once indifferent to the squabbles of the gentry, were now eyeing every closed carriage and remote cottage with suspicion. Andrew knew his time was running out. He began to move her every few hours, traveling under the cover of darkness across the most treacherous parts of the moors. Mary's physical condition was now critical. She was suffering from exposure and the early stages of a fever, yet she forced herself to remain conscious, to remain present. She knew that the rescue, if it came, would be a matter of seconds, not minutes. She needed to be ready to run, to scream, to make herself known to the world that was searching for her. The romanticized image of the Highland escape that Andrew had tried to sell her was now a grim, muddy reality of fear and filth. He had become a caricature of a villain, his clothes torn and his face overgrown with a ragged beard, his eyes darting incessantly. In contrast, Mary, despite her rags and her illness, possessed a quiet, regal dignity that seemed to infuriate him more than any verbal defiance. She was a living reminder of the world he could never truly belong to, no matter how much of her money he spent. He began to realize that even if he killed her, even if he hid her body in the deepest peat bog in England, he had already lost. The law was no longer a distant concept in a London courtroom, it was a physical force moving toward them through the mist. In the final hours of her time as a hostage of the North, held in a small, damp room in an inn near Penrith, Mary Eleanor Bowes sat and watched the sun rise over the fells. She could hear the sound of horses in the courtyard, not the tired, overworked horses of Andrew's mercenaries, but the crisp, disciplined trot of the king's men. The tension in the room was so thick it felt as though the air itself might shatter. Andrew stood by the door, his pistol drawn, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Mary didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply waited, a woman of the law standing in the heart of an outlaw's kingdom. The great kidnapping was reaching its end, and the woman who had been dragged across the country in chains was about to become the most powerful witness in British history. Chapter 8: The Rescue at Penrith. The dawn that broke over the fells of Westmoreland was not the gentle, golden light of a romantic novel. It was a cold, piercing grey that cut through the mist like a surgeon's blade. Inside the small, cramped room of the remote inn near Penrith, the air was stagnant with the smell of damp wool and the metallic tang of Andrew's unwashed fear. He stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the morning light, clutching a heavy brass pistol with knuckles that were white and bloodless. For 11 days, he had dragged Mary Eleanor Bowes through the mud and the mire, believing that if he could only reach the deeper wilderness of the Scottish borders, he could make her vanish forever. But the world had grown too small for his crimes. The roads were blocked, the villages were watchful, and the law, a force he had long treated with arrogant contempt, was now thundering toward the inn on the hoofs of the King's Bench constables. Mary sat on the edge of a sagging bed, her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that was almost supernatural. Her body was a map of exhaustion, her silk gown was reduced to a grey, sodden rag, and her feet were swollen and bruised from the miles she had been forced to walk when the carriage horses failed. Yet, in this moment of ultimate peril, she felt a strange, crystalline clarity. She watched Andrew, noting the way his eyes darted from the door to the window, and realized that the romantic tension that had once blinded her was now replaced by the cold, analytical gaze of a survivor. He was no longer her husband, nor was he her master. He was a hunted animal, and she was the bait that had finally led the hounds to his throat. When a sharp, authoritative rap echoed against the heavy oak door below, the silence in the room shattered like glass. Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes, by order of the King's Bench, open this door. The voice from the courtyard was booming and resolute, carrying the weight of a nation's indignation. Andrew let out a low, guttural snarl, spinning toward Mary with the pistol raised. For a heartbeat, she stared into the dark, hollow bore of the weapon, seeing the end of her life in the trembling of his finger. He looked at her with a mixture of hatred and a desperate, pathetic longing, as if he still expected her to save him from the consequences of his own madness. "If they take me, Mary, you go to the grave first," he hissed, his voice cracking. But Mary did not flinch. She had lived in the shadow of his violence for so long that the threat of death felt less terrifying than the prospect of another day in his company. She looked him in the eye and said nothing, her silence a wall he could not climb. The inn erupted into a cacophony of violence. The sound of a heavy shoulder hitting the door downstairs was followed by the splintering of timber and the frantic shouts of Andrew's few remaining henchmen as they were overwhelmed by the constables. The heavy boots of the King's men thundered up the narrow wooden stairs, each step a heartbeat in the countdown to her liberation. Andrew lunged for Mary, intending to use her as a human shield, his hand catching the collar of her dress and tearing the delicate fabric. But as he dragged her toward the center of the room, the door was kicked off its hinges with a deafening crash. A tall, grim-faced constable named Christopher Chapman stood in the doorway, his own pistol leveled at Andrew's chest. The standoff lasted only a second, but to Mary, it felt like an eternity suspended in the cold morning air. "Drop the weapon, Bowes," Chapman commanded, his voice steady and devoid of mercy. "The game is over. The Countess is under the protection of the Crown." For a moment, it seemed Andrew might fire, not at the lawman, but at the woman he had spent years trying to break. His thumb moved over the hammer of the pistol, his face contorted in a mask of impotent rage. But the sheer presence of the law, the physical manifestation of the society he had tried to defy, finally shattered his resolve. The pistol clattered to the floor, and Andrew fell to his knees, not in repentance, but in a sudden, cowardly collapse. The constables swarmed the room, pinning him to the floorboards as he began to wail about his rights as a husband and the betrayal of his wife. Mary Eleanor Bowes did not look at him as they dragged him out. She stood slowly, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean against the bedpost for support. Constable Chapman stepped forward, his expression softening as he took in the state of the woman who had been the most celebrated heiress in England. He draped his own heavy, woolen cloak over her shivering shoulders, the scent of horse and rainwater 1,000 times sweeter than the perfumes of Streetlam. "You are safe, my lady," he whispered. "The carriage is waiting to take you back to London. You will never have to see him again." Mary looked at him, her eyes welling with tears for the first time in years, not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief that her personhood had finally been recognized by something greater than a husband's whim. The journey back to London was the inverse of her kidnapping. Instead of a flight through the darkness, it was a slow, triumphant procession through the daylight. At every village, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the victimized countess, their cheers echoing against the hills. Mary sat in the comfort of a well-sprung carriage, surrounded by guards who treated her with a deference she had forgotten existed. She spent the hours writing in a new journal, her mind already turning toward the legal battle that lay ahead. She knew that Andrew's arrest was only the beginning. He would use every trick in the legal book to claim that she had gone with him willingly, that her secret history was a fabrication, and that the laws of marriage still gave him absolute power over her body and her wealth. As the carriage crossed the threshold into London, Mary looked out at the smog-choked horizon and felt a surge of cold, diamond-hard determination. She had been rescued from the stone walls of a northern inn, but she still had to be rescued from the stone walls of the law itself. She was no longer a hostage, she was a witness. The romantic tension of her life had been burned away in the crucible of the Pennines, leaving behind a woman who understood that true power did not come from a fortune, but from the ability to stand before a judge and tell the truth. The rescue at Penrith had saved her life, but now she would have to save her future. As the carriage pulled up to the gates of the King's Bench, Mary Eleanor Bowes stepped out, her head held high, ready to turn her private agony into a public revolution. Chapter 9, The Trial of the Century. The courtroom of the King's Bench was a cavernous theatre of oak and shadow, packed to the rafters with the elite of London society, all clamouring to witness the fall of a titan or the final crushing of a countess. The air was thick with the scent of wick powder, old parchment, and the electric tension of a scandal that had gripped the nation's heart. Mary Eleanor Bowes sat at the petitioner's table, a figure of stark, monochromatic dignity in her mourning silk. She had survived the physical kidnappings and the desolate moors, but this, the public dissection of her character, was a different kind of ordeal. Across the room sat Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes, looking remarkably composed, his legal team prepared to argue that a husband's right to his wife's person and property was the bedrock of English civilization. The romantic tension that had once defined their meeting was now a grotesque spectre, a ghost of a lie that Andrew still tried to evoke with his practiced, mournful gazes toward the bench. The trial began not with a discussion of the kidnapping, but with a brutal assault on Mary's reputation. Andrew's counsel painted a picture of a woman driven by female caprice and intellectual vanity, suggesting that her botanical studies were a cover for clandestine affairs and that her secret history was the product of a fevered, hysterical imagination. They argued that Andrew had not kidnapped her, but had rescued her from the corrupting influence of London lawyers who sought to alienate a wife from her natural master. Mary felt the eyes of the gallery boring into her, the whispers of the tongue like the hissing of serpents. To many in that room, the idea of a woman suing for divorce based on cruelty was an affront to the divine order of marriage. She realized that she was not just fighting for her fortune, she was fighting to prove that she was a human being with rights that the law was bound to respect. When it was finally Mary's turn to take the stand, a hush fell over the court so profound that the scratching of the clerk's quill sounded like thunder. She stood before the judges, her voice at first a mere whisper, then gaining strength until it rang clear and unwavering through the hall. She did not speak of her wealth, she spoke of the coal cellar at Gibside. She did not speak of her titles, she spoke of the bruise on her cheek and the weight of the chains at Penrith. She detailed the systematic psychological erosion Andrew had employed, the way he had used her children as pawns, and the terrifying moment he had held a pistol to her head in the moonlight. As she spoke, the secret history was entered into evidence, the scraps of paper she had hidden in her stays and smuggled through the hands of a brave maid. The raw, unvarnished truth of those pages began to turn the tide of public opinion, peeling back the veneer of the gentleman to reveal the predator beneath. The psychological warfare shifted to the witness stand as Andrew's lawyers tried to break her. They questioned her mothering, her spending, and her sanity, attempting to provoke the very hysteria they claimed she possessed. But Mary was a woman who had been tempered in a much hotter fire than a courtroom cross-examination. She answered every jab with a cool, scientific precision, treating her own trauma as a subject to be analyzed and documented. She showed the court that her intelligence was not a feminine weakness, but her greatest weapon. The tension reached a breaking point when the maid, Mary, was called to testify. The girl's trembling but honest account of the abuses she had witnessed provided the corroboration the judges needed. It was no longer just the word of a disobedient wife, it was the testimony of a witness to a crime. The legal crux of the trial rested on the validity of the prenuptial agreement Mary had signed before the marriage. Andrew's team argued that by the law of coverture, a woman's legal existence was suspended during marriage, and therefore any prior agreement was void the moment she said, "I do." It was a terrifyingly sound legal argument for the 18th century. However, Mary's lawyers countered with a revolutionary concept, that a husband who had obtained a marriage through fraud and maintained it through extreme cruelty had forfeited his marital rights. They argued that the prenuptial deed was a protective measure against a known fortune hunter and that to invalidate it would be to reward kidnapping and domestic terrorism. The judges, led by the formidable Lord Loughborough, found themselves at a crossroads between ancient tradition and the obvious, visceral demands of justice. The romanticized image of marriage as a holy union was being stripped bare in the King's Bench, revealed as a potential cover for the most heinous of crimes. Andrew's composure began to crack as the evidence of his debts and his previous conquests came to light. He was exposed not as a loving husband, but as a professional predator who specialized in the ruin of wealthy widows. The tension in the courtroom was no longer about whether Mary was good or bad, but about whether the law would continue to be a shield for men like Stoney Bowes. Mary watched him from across the aisle, seeing him clearly for the first time, a small, desperate man who had built a kingdom on lies. She realized that by standing her ground, she was opening a door for every woman who would come after her, a door that led out of the darkness of absolute ownership and into the light of legal personhood. As the trial drew to its close, the atmosphere in London was one of feverish anticipation. Broadside ballads were written about the indomitable Countess, and the public, once skeptical, now cheered her carriage as she left the court each day. The trial of the century had become a referendum on the nature of power and the limits of a husband's authority. Mary Eleanor Bowes sat through the final arguments, her face a mask of calm, but her heart was a drum of anxiety. She knew that the verdict would determine not just where she lived, but whether she truly owned her own life. She thought of her children, of the gardens at Gibside, and of the freedom that felt so close she could almost taste it. She had done everything she could, she had laid her soul bare before the world. Now, all that remained was the voice of the law. The judges retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended animation. Mary returned to her temporary lodgings, unable to eat or sleep, the echoes of the trial ringing in her ears. She felt a strange sense of mourning for the years she had lost, but also a fierce, burning pride. She had not broken. She had not signed. She had fought the richest and most powerful man in her life and had brought him to his knees with nothing but a pen and the truth. The verdict was coming, a thunderclap that would either shatter her world or finally, mercifully, set her free. As the morning of the final judgment dawned, Mary Eleanor Bowes donned her finest silk, not as a victim, but as a woman prepared to meet her destiny. Chapter 10, The Legacy of Mary Eleanor Bowes. The silence that filled the court of the King's Bench on the final day of the proceedings was heavier than the stones of Streetlam. When the judges returned, their faces etched with the gravity of their decision, the very air seemed to hold its breath. Lord Loughborough's voice was a steady chime of justice as he delivered a verdict that would echo through the centuries. The court ruled that Mary Eleanor Bowes was granted a divorce immensa et thoro, but more importantly, it upheld the validity of her prenuptial agreement. For the first time in English history, the law recognized that a woman's attempt to protect her property from a husband's greed was not an act of fraud, but a right of self-preservation. Andrew Robinson Stoney Bowes was stripped of his control over her estates, and his subsequent conviction for the kidnapping saw him spend the rest of his miserable life within the walls of a debtor's prison, a fittingly small cage for a man who had tried to swallow the world. Mary Eleanor Bowes emerged from the courtroom not as a broken victim, but as a pioneer. She reclaimed her ancestral home, her coal mines, and, most precious of all, her children. The romantic tension of her youth was replaced by a profound, tranquil independence. She returned to her botanical studies, transforming her estates into some of the most scientifically significant gardens in the world, proving that her mind was a fertile ground that no tyrant could salt. She spent her remaining years in the quiet company of her books and the vibrant colors of her rare plants, finally at peace within her own skin. Her story became the cornerstone of modern marital law, a testament to the fact that cruelty is never discipline, and that a woman's identity is not a gift to be granted by a husband, but a birthright to be defended by the state. Mary Eleanor Bowes, the woman who was kidnapped by her husband only to become the law, passed away in 1800, but her spirit lives on every time a person stands up to claim their own autonomy. She had turned her golden cage into a lighthouse, ensuring that no one else would ever have to be lost in the darkness of another's shadow again.